Greetings from the Appalachian Mountains, where you will discover one of the most unsettling tales ever told. You're about to uncover a mystery that defies all logic, so leave a comment from where you're watching. This video was made purely for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any similarity to real people living or deceased is entirely coincidental. Consider the Appalachian Mountains in 1908 for a moment. Not only are we discussing a remote location, but a true maze of deep valleys, dense. Communities and forests were so distant from one another that silence was practically a physical presence. It was an area with poorly marked dirt roads winding between peaks shrouded in mist, where nature still had complete control over the few who ventured to live there. West Virginia was a region of extreme contrasts at the time. While modernity was starting to arrive through the first railroads, the majority of people continued to live the way their grandparents had, relying on the land, hunting, and harboring a strong mistrust of strangers. It was in. This is where our story starts. In the center of County Greenbrier, in a tiny community known as Thornwood. The village was so small, just a few wooden homes strewn along a small valley, encircled by mountains that seemed to reach the sky, that it didn't even show up on most maps of the era. The locals led modest lives, working on small farms, harvesting wood, or extracting coal from deep within the mountains. Social life revolved around the local church, and Elijah Mand, the pastor, was revered as the voice of morality and reason in a society that still practiced antiquated superstitions. However, there was something about Thornwood that bothered people every time they went through. Those who occasionally traversed the area to get to bigger cities described a peculiar sensation, as though the forest's eyes were watching them all the time. Some claimed it was simply the outcome of spending days alone on the trails, but others insisted there was more, something that defied simple explanation. There, the valleys were darker, the trees were denser, and the fog frequently descended suddenly from the mountains, turning the world into a place where illusion and reality were indistinguishable. Something started to happen in Thornwood during that year's fall, when the leaves started to change color and the temperature dropped. It was a string of odd events that could have been written off as coincidences on their own, rather than a sudden event. The animals came first. Farmers started to observe that. Their hens stopped producing eggs, and the cattle started to moo a lot at night, as though they could sense a bad thing coming. Known for their bravery when confronting bears and other predators, the dogs started howling in unison each night, a sound that reverberated throughout the valleys and kept the locals awake and tense. Then the residents themselves gave their testimonies. Margaret Hartley, a woman renowned for her pragmatism and lack of fantasy, vowed she had. Observed odd lights dancing in the trees close to her home. As if in search of something, she described the lights as pale spheres that rose and fell up and down the mountain slopes, moving with a purpose of their own. The next morning, when her husband Thomas went to look into it, all he discovered were odd footprints in the mud that didn't appear to belong to any known local animal. They had an uneven shape, as though something heavy had dragged them, but they were too big to be from a bear. Something on the other side of the floor. Similar stories started to come from other locals. While working alone, Samuel Briggs, a lumberjack, claimed to have heard voices coming from the forest. He heard voices that sounded like they were calling his name, but they stopped when he tried to get close. One night, a merchant who lived on the outskirts of the village woke up feeling as though someone was keeping an eye on his home. And as he peered out the window, he noticed a tall, dark figure standing as still as a statue at the edge of the forest. He let out a cry and the figure just disappeared, seemingly engulfed by the shadows. In an attempt to reassure his parishioners, Pastor Mland claimed that these were only mental tricks brought on by the seclusion and the impending cold. He arranged church gatherings where he gave talks on courage and faith. But the truth is that Milland himself had gone through something that left him profoundly troubled, so even he was unable to conceal the uneasiness in his voice. After visiting a sick congregation member one evening, he felt he was being pursued. He spun around multiple times, but all he saw were the tree shadows created by the dim moonlight. But as soon as he got home and shut the door, he could plainly hear heavy footsteps walking around his property. Hours passed before the footsteps finally stopped just before dawn. The tension in Thornwood increased as October went on. Individuals started locking their doors earlier, staying indoors at night, and discussing potential threats in whispers. Some of the elderly locals recalled old tales, legends passed down from their grandparents about spirits that lived in the mountains long before any settlers came. They described locations where things that shouldn't exist could cross over to our side, and where the barrier between worlds was thin. However, the younger generation swiftly put an end to these tales, viewing them as ridiculous superstitions from a less knowledgeable era. Then came the time that would alter Thornwood's residents' lives forever. It was a especially chilly November evening when the first winter frost was starting to form on the windows of the homes. The mountains were bathed in a silvery light from the full moon, and there was such a deep silence that every sound seemed to be magnified. The Whitmore family, who lived on the northern edge of the village, where the forest was denser and the neighbors farther away, was the site of the incident on this particular night. Jonathan Whitmore was a strong, sensible, middle-aged man, renowned for being skeptical of the bizarre tales that were going around the village. He had openly mocked those who described enigmatic voices and lights in the forest, blaming them all on heightened anxiety and fertile imagination. Although Elizabeth, his wife, was more circumspect, she trusted her husband's judgment and made an effort to keep their daily routine normal. They had a small barn where they stored their tools and lived in a modest but well-constructed home surrounded by fields they farmed. Supplies for the winter. Elizabeth was about to finish washing the dinner dishes at 10 o'clock that evening when she heard something that instantly caused her to stop. It was the sound of something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor of the barn. Still certain that it was just a raccoon or some other animal seeking food, Jonathan, who was reading by the fireplace, picked up his flashlight and went to investigate when she called to him. Elizabeth watched her husband's flashlight light from the doorway, sway as he made his way across the yard to the barn. Jonathan lifted his lantern and opened the barn door, letting light shine inside. With the grain sacks piled against the wall and the tools hanging where they should be, everything appeared to be in order. Then he became aware of an oddity. There were circular marks on the floor in the barn's far corner that suggested someone had dragged something heavy. Deep and illogically carved into the wood were the marks. He came over to look at them. Closer, and he sensed a presence at that moment. Although he couldn't see or hear it clearly, it was evident that the air around him had grown denser and heavier. With the lantern shaking in his hand, Jonathan spun around, but nothing was there. Just the cold wind coming through the wall cracks and the shadows created by the roof beams. Just as he turned to go, he heard a whisper. It was obviously a voice from somewhere, but it wasn't loud enough to discern words. Within the barn. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Whitmore experienced genuine fear as his heart started to race. He hurried out of the barn, locked the door, and went home to find Elizabeth waiting tensely. Elizabeth paled as he described what he had heard and seen. She demanded that they remain up all night and that all windows and doors be locked. Jonathan agreed, still attempting to remain calm. However, they were both aware that something had changed. That feeling of safety they experienced kept up. The conviction that there was a logical explanation for everything had been challenged. They waited for dawn while sitting in the room and keeping the fire going. But even more unsettling revelations came with dawn. Jonathan went outside to take another look at the barn in the bright sunlight when it finally came. He was stunned by what he discovered. Everything inside had been looted, and the barn door, which he was certain he had locked the previous evening, was ajar. The floor was littered with tools. Grain sacks had been ripped apart, and there was something that chilled his blood in the middle of the barn. A strange symbol, a complex geometric shape with lines that intersected hypnotically, was drawn on the floor with what looked to be ashes. The symbol was unfamiliar to Jonathan, but there was something incredibly unsettling about it, as if staring at it for too long could result in something horrible. When Elizabeth saw the symbol, she covered her mouth with her hands after following her husband to the barn. She realized that Mark. When she was younger, her grandmother, who had grown up in the mountains and was familiar with the old tales, had shown her similar drawings and warned her not to play with or reproduce them. According to her grandmother, those who wished to communicate with objects that should stay on the other side used these ancient marks. When she saw it drawn on the floor of her own barn, Elizabeth, who had never taken it seriously and thought it was just part of the local folklore, could no longer ignore it. After quickly covering the symbol with dirt until it was hidden, Jonathan and Elizabeth locked the barn once more. They kept the incident a secret out of fear of mockery, or, worse, that discussing it would draw more unwelcome attention. However, the secret weighed heavily on them, and in the days that followed, they both noticed changes in themselves. Elizabeth started experiencing intense nightmares in which she was walking through the mountains at night and saw shadowy people observing her from the trees. Jonathan, on the other hand, grew more and more suspicious, checking the locks multiple times a night and becoming alarmed at any strange noise. At the same time, other residents of Thornwood started to share similar stories. After her husband passed away, Dorothy Chen, a single woman, woke up one morning to discover all of her windows open, even though she was positive she had shut them before bed. Henry Blake, a farmer, found that his normally peaceful and submissive horse had broken through the fences. Its eyes were wide with fear as it ran in circles across the field during the night. The animal almost trampled Henry when he attempted to calm it down, which had never happened before. When Pastor Milland saw that things were getting out of hand, he took action. All the villagers were invited to a special meeting he called at the church. The church was crowded on the night of the meeting, with weary eyes and pale faces occupying the pews. Moreland climbed into the pulpit and started talking, his words resonating off the walls made of wood. He talked about faith, the value of staying together, and the need to resist letting fear rule them. Even so, he sensed that his words weren't getting through to the people as they ought to. Too much fear had taken hold. Then, an unexpected event occurred. The church was completely dark when all of the candles went out at once during Moreland's sermon. There was complete quiet, only disturbed by the sound of anxious breathing, and the wooden pews creaked. Then a voice started to whisper from deep within the church. It wasn't English. Rather, it was an older language that was unfamiliar to everyone but carried a terrible burden. The whisper intensified, reverberating throughout the church until someone finally yelled, causing everyone to rush to the doors. The night was oddly quiet when the church doors opened and the people hurried out. As though nothing had occurred, the moon shone over Thornwood, and the chilly mountain air appeared typical once more. With lanterns lit, a few of the more courageous locals returned inside the church to try to find an explanation for what had happened. No draft or wind could have put out all the candles at once, but they were all out. Pastor Moreland was unable to provide consolation or an explanation as he stood in the pulpit, pale and shaking. Nobody in Thornwood could get a good night's sleep that night. Families gathered in their homes, conversing and keeping the lights on, in whispered tones until daybreak. Everyone had the same sense that something had changed irrevocably, as though an imperceptible boundary had been crossed and there was no going back. Some started discussing leaving the village and taking sanctuary in bigger cities where the darkness of the mountains didn't seem to penetrate as deeply and civilization appeared to be stronger. However, leaving Thornwood was not an easy choice. That land was a symbol of generations of labor and sacrifice for the majority of families. Their houses, their farms, everything they owned was present. Giving everything up would mean starting over in a strange location with no assurance of employment or housing. Additionally, a part of them resisted being kicked out, a stubborn pride that demanded to confront whatever was going on. In the midst of this uncertainty, a stranger showed up in Thornwood. Riding a gray horse along the dirt road to the village, he arrived on a foggy December morning. Marcus Hole was his name, and he described himself as an unexplained student. Phenomena, a man who traversed the isolated Appalachian region, gathering tales and attempting to decipher the secrets the mountains held. He carried a leather bag filled with books and notebooks full of notes, and he was tall and thin with dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. As a meeting place for the few travelers passing through Thornwood, the small inn was where Marcus requested permission to stay. At first, Ruth Campbell, the innkeeper, was hesitant, but the possibility of some additional cash persuaded her to agree. Marcus took a room upstairs and started exploring the village right away, asking questions and paying close attention to the locals' stories. He was initially viewed with suspicion. Even in normal times, when everyone was about to have a nervous breakdown, strangers weren't welcome. However, Marcus's voice exuded confidence and an unflinching serenity that stood in stark contrast to the village's prevailing fear. He didn't make fun of people's experiences or attempt to provide oversimplified explanations. Rather, he listened politely and meticulously recorded information in his notebooks, posing targeted queries regarding particulars that others might have missed. Marcus was eventually informed about the symbol that had been drawn on Elizabeth Whitmore's barn. In order to do this covertly, she asked him to come see the property while Jonathan was out in the fields. Marcus accepted, and when he saw where the symbol had been covered with dirt, he requested authorization to excavate and look at it. Elizabeth was hesitant, but Marcus's sincerity persuaded her that he could be of assistance. They worked together to carefully remove the earth until the symbol was once again visible. Marcus studied the mark's curves and lines for a long time without saying anything. Then he grabbed one of his books from his bag and quickly skimmed through it, comparing the symbol to old drawings on the yellowed pages. At last, he discovered something that caused his eyes to enlarge. The symbol was used in an old custom. He described it to Elizabeth as a means of delineating boundaries or creating openings between various states of existence. It was no matter how you handled it. As Elizabeth listened to Marcus, a shiver went down her spine. She inquired as to whether she and Jonathan were in danger and what this meant for them. Marcus told the truth. He claimed that although he didn't know everything, the symbol's existence indicated that something had been attracted to or awakened there. He suggested that the best course of action was to, if at all possible, stay away from the barn and cover the symbol once more. However, he cautioned that there was more going on at Thornwood than just that singular incident. In the days that followed, Marcus spoke with more locals, gathered testimonies, and charted the areas where the odd happenings had been most severe. He saw a trend. The older and denser forest north of the village appeared to be the focal point of all the activities. It was an area where the locals naturally avoided, a location that even the most skilled hunters would not go without a valid reason. Marcus made the decision that he had to look into that area himself. At a spontaneous gathering at the inn, he declared his intention, and a number of the villagers attempted to talk him out of it. Marcus was adamant, despite Dorothy Chen's strong opinions that no one who went into that area of the forest with malicious intent ever came out of it sane. He believed he was getting close to understanding this phenomenon after years of studying it. Something significant. But he consented to go with someone. Henry Blake, the farmer whose horse had gone crazy, and Pastor Mland offered to go with him because they felt it was their responsibility to protect the people in their care. The three men left for the northern forest the next morning. A chilly wind blew through the valleys on this gray day, with low clouds that appeared to press against the mountains. Every step they took them farther into a territory as they followed a narrow path that vanished among the trees, where there was hardly any sunlight. The old trees there had moss-covered thick trunks and twisted roots that gripped the ground like claws. The only sounds in the oppressive silence were their own heavy breathing and footsteps. They reached a small circular clearing after more than an hour of walking. Something in the middle of the clearing caused the three men to halt suddenly. It was a stone construction that was obviously created by humans, despite being partially obscured by vegetation. The stones were big and uneven, grouped in a nearly perfect circle, with what looked like a well or a hole in the ground in the middle. Marcus stepped closer, his gaze scrutinizing every inch of the building. Evidently uneasy, Mand and Blake stayed on the edge of the clearing. Marcus knelt close to the stone well, attempting to see what was inside, while the pastor muttered a prayer under his breath. The aperture plunged sharply downward and vanished into utter blackness. Marcus grabbed a tiny stone and hurled it into the... I was hoping to hear the sound of it striking the bottom. However, the sound never materialized. The stone just disappeared into the quiet, as though it were engulfed by an endless emptiness. They heard it at that moment. There was a low, steady whisper that seemed to be calling, inviting, coming from inside the well. Marcus recoiled instinctively, and the three men looked at each other, knowing without having to say it that they had discovered the source of Thornwood's torment. However, locating the source didn't imply being aware of it or being able to prevent it. Actually, that finding only served to confirm that they were dealing with something that was well beyond their understanding. In silence, the three men, each absorbed in his own sinister thoughts, departed from the clearing. The journey back felt more drawn out and oppressive than the one there, as though the forest was maliciously observing their every step. Marcus's fingers gripped the handle of his leather suitcase nervously as he kept his eyes on the ground in front of him. Mand muttered bits of prayers, finding solace in well-known phrases, and Blake kept looking over his shoulder because he couldn't get rid of the sensation that something was pursuing them through the trees. They felt as though they could breathe again when they eventually came out of the forest and saw the village of Thornwood again. However, that respite was fleeting. They knew something was amiss as they got closer to the first houses. The streets were empty. Everything was enveloped in an unnatural silence, and every home's windows and doors were closed. Despite the fact that it was mid-afternoon, Marcus felt a constriction in his chest and accelerated in the direction of the inn, where Ruth Campbell typically made dinner at that hour. The door of the boarding house swayed slightly in the wind like a jar. Calling Ruth's name, Marcus slowly pushed it open and stepped inside. There was no response. There were broken dishes on the floor, chairs flipped over, and the main room looked like it had been the scene of a violent incident. Blake and Moreland trailed him inside, their faces whitened by the sight. Marcus hurried up the stairs and looked in each room, but nobody was there. There was nobody in the boarding house. They went outside and started calling out to the occupants of nearby homes as they knocked on their doors. At last, a door cracked open, revealing Dorothy Chen's terrified face. As soon as they were inside, she swiftly dragged them in and locked the door once more. They discovered a number of families huddled together in the main room of the house. their faces displaying signs of weariness and terror. In a quiet voice, Dorothy described what had transpired during their time in the forest. The sky, which had been cloudy but comparatively clear, abruptly darkened dramatically, as if a black curtain had been drawn over the sun at about noon, when most people were occupied with their daily tasks. This was an event that everyone described in the same way, even though they were in different places. It was a thick, heavy darkness that seemed to have its own substance rather than an eclipse or a typical storm. Individuals, those inside locked doors and windows, experiencing an inexplicable instinctual fear, while those outside fled to their homes. Strange noises reverberated throughout the village during the nearly hour-long darkness. The streets were filled with the sound of heavy footsteps as something big moved from house to house, pausing in front of each door as though making a decision. Some claimed to have heard voices calling their names and pleading to be allowed inside. These voices sounded like those of departed loved ones. However, everyone had a profound and innate conviction that it would be a terrible and irreparable error to open any door in that darkness. This error had been made by the landlady, Ruth Campbell. Dorothy claims that when night fell, Ruth was by herself in the boarding house. There was a sudden total silence after the neighbors heard screams coming from the building. The boarding house was deserted and in ruins when the light eventually came back on, but Ruth was nowhere to be seen. She had just disappeared, leaving no sign of. What might have happened to her, or where might she have gone? Marcus was overcome with a heavy burden of guilt. He had traveled to Thornwood in an attempt to unravel the secrets of the mountains, but it appeared that his presence and his research had sped up and worsened the situation. He pondered whether they had discovered something that was better left alone when they came across the stone structure in the forest and the seemingly bottomless well. Pastor Mand touched his shoulder as though he could feel the man's tormented thoughts racing through his head. The largest and most central home in Thornwood, Dorothy's, was the gathering place for all the remaining residents that evening. Everyone felt that being together provided at least the appearance of security, and nobody wanted to be by themselves. By candlelight, Marcus spent hours poring over his books and notebooks in an attempt to find a reference or an old tale that might provide advice on how to handle what they were up against. He discovered fragments, references to protective rites and symbols that were said to be able to fend off evil forces, but nothing conclusive or certain to be effective. One of those present, Elizabeth Whitmore, walked up to Marcus and whispered, "Do you think we're all going to die there?" Marcus was unable to lie as he gazed into her weary and terrified eyes. He stated that he had no idea what would occur, but as long as they remained together and clung to, there was still a chance, hope. Even though they weren't the most consoling words, they were honest, and for some reason, that meant more than just making empty promises. As the night went on, they started to hear footsteps outside once more, circling the house slowly. The persistent scratching that made the hairs on the back of everyone's neck stand on end was the sound of something being dragged along the outer wall. A few started crying in private. Some just sat still, while others prayed with renewed zeal, hoping they would hold while gazing at the windows and doors that were locked. Marcus got up and moved to the closest window, cautiously looking through a hole in the curtains. He could see shapes moving in the darkness outside in the faint moonlight. They were not quite solid, more like distorted, dense shadows that assumed outlines that were vaguely humanoid, in ways that caused his eyes to ache when he tried to concentrate on them. They glided across the ground without actually touching it, moving with an unnatural fluidity. They moved in what appeared to be a ritualistic pattern, coming and going from the house. Marcus and Henry Blake sat together at the window and watched for a few minutes without saying anything. At last, Blake uttered a question that they were all considering but were hesitant to ask. What was the desire of those things? Marcus slowly shook his head. He had theories, concepts derived from fractured knowledge and old tales, but nothing tangible. Maybe they were beings that were drawn to something and existed on the edge of reality. Maybe they were signs of something much older, something that lived in Thornwood long before anyone had considered establishing a village there. After hearing what was being said, Pastor Mland came over and suggested that they try a protective ritual. He was not familiar with such methods. His faith had always been easier and more direct, but now he was prepared to try anything. Marcus concurred and started teaching everyone in attendance how to form a circle of protection, reciting words of banishment that he had copied from one of his old books and using salt that Dorothy had in her pantry. Together, they created a continuous barrier around the house by applying salt to all of the windows and doors. Despite his fear, Marcus led the recitation with a firm voice, and the others followed suit, even though they didn't fully comprehend what he was saying. In addition to desperation, it was an act of defiance, a refusal to accept whatever was going on in silence. When they completed, there was a brief pause before the unexpected sounds from outside stopped. The ensuing quiet was nearly more eerie than the sounds that had come before. It seemed as though the entities outside were thinking about assessing the recently constructed barrier. Knowing that this might only be a brief respite, Marcus refused to let himself unwind. Until dawn, he told everyone to stay inside the salt circle and not to go outside of it for any reason. The ensuing hours were a tense vigil in which every sound caused eyes to roll back and hearts to race. Around 3 a.m, Jonathan Whitmore broke the silence. He was sitting in a corner, staring at a blank area of the wall, when all of a sudden he started talking softly. He was responding to questions that only he seemed to hear, rather than speaking to anyone else in the room. Elizabeth hurried over to him and called his name in an attempt to get him to return, but Jonathan appeared to be lost in a state of trance. He spoke incoherently, in bits and pieces of conversations about faraway places and incomprehensible things. Marcus saw the warning signs and hurried over. Something was pulling Jonathan's body and mind apart. In order to bring the man's awareness back to the present, Marcus started reciting anchoring words while maintaining a firm grip on his shoulders. Holding her husband's hand, Elizabeth joined him and talked to him about their shared memories, particular instances from their shared lives. Jonathan blinked slowly and painfully, his gaze returning to the faces in front of him. Jonathan was shaking and drenched in sweat when he finally regained consciousness. In a terrified voice, he recounted what he had gone through. He claimed to have heard a voice calling to him, making promises, and displaying images of a time when he would be respected and powerful, and would not have to battle the hostile terrain of the mountains. The voice had been alluring, convincing, and nearly unavoidable. He was certain that he would have gone straight through the doors and out of the house to find whatever was waiting outside if Marcus and Elizabeth hadn't stepped in. Everyone could see from this incident that the entities had not given up. They were merely shifting strategies, trying to find ways to get around the residents' physical defenses by going straight after their minds. Marcus cautioned everyone to stay alert, keep their thoughts focused, communicate with one another, and to remain rooted in their common reality. They had to endure until dawn now, and it was an endurance battle. Dorothy Chen started to softly sing a song that her mother had sung to her when she was younger. It was a more straightforward song about sunny days and honest labor, about green fields and crystal-clear rivers, rather than a religious one. As others joined her, their voices blended into a melancholic yet imperfect tune. The music appeared to be beneficial, fostering a bond among them all, serving as a reminder of humanity and life in the midst of the surrounding darkness. The hours passed in agonizing slowness. Marcus continued to go through his notes, looking for any more information that might be helpful. In one of his oldest books, he discovered a passage about power centers in the mountains, places where the line between worlds was inherently thinner. These locations might serve as entry points or portals for things that wouldn't typically be able to enter our world. That description certainly applied to the stone structure they had discovered in the forest. However, the book also mentioned that certain rituals carried out at the precise location could close and seal these portals. It was risky, it was feasible, but it required being close to the problem's origin. Marcus thought about telling the others, but he was hesitant. It seemed like you were asking someone to walk directly to their demise by asking them to go back to that forest and clearing. But how long could they actually survive if they did nothing but waited and tried to survive? Final? After noticing Marcus's intense study of the book, Pastor Mand came over and inquired about his findings. Marcus pointed to the pertinent passages while speaking softly. Mand read intently, silently moving his lips as he took in the words. When he was done, he gave Marcus a serious yet resolute look. They had to try if there was a chance to end this, Moreland said. They were unable to wait for things to get better on their own. They made the decision to hold off until dawn before making any ultimate choice. It felt as though a burden had been lifted when the first rays of daylight streamed through the windows and illuminated the sky. With the coming of the light, the dark forms that had encircled the house during the night had disappeared. Examining his surroundings, Marcus cautiously opened the front door and stepped outside. Once again, everything appeared to be as usual, just a quiet mountain village in the gloomy winter light. However, everyone was aware that normalcy was a myth. Marcus convened a small gathering to talk about the strategy. Henry Blake, in addition to himself and Pastor Mland, insisted on going. He felt obligated to make amends for surviving when Ruth Campbell did not. Still reeling from the night's events, Jonathan Whitmore offered his assistance as well, stating that he couldn't watch helplessly as others put their lives in danger. Jonathan refused to leave despite Elizabeth's entreaties. This was something he had to do for himself and everyone else. They spent the morning getting ready, assembling materials, and going over They would have to carry out a ritual. Marcus ensured that everyone understood every step by copying the pertinent instructions from his book onto a sheet of paper. They had to form a protective circle around the stone structure, say certain banishing words, and then seal the opening with a consecrated earth, salt, and iron mixture. Although it didn't sound very complicated, Marcus was aware that the challenge would not be in the technical execution, but rather in carrying out all of this while overcoming any opposition they may run into. The four men left for the forest to the north at about noon. The sun shone through the trees in a way that seemed almost reassuring, and the day was surprisingly clear. However, as they continued on the same path through the forest, the sense of hope and light dimmed. The trees appeared to enclose them, and the sunlight grew progressively weaker until they were once more in the never-ending twilight that defined that area of the forest. They arrived at the clearing and paused at the edge to look around. The stone building was just as they had left it, but the atmosphere had changed. It was denser and heavier, as though the atmosphere was opposing their presence. Marcus stepped forward, holding his supply bag firmly, and the others trailed behind, forming a line as they all went into the clearing. They established the protective circle around the stone structure in a swift manner. Blake brought small pieces of iron from his farm, and Marcus poured salt in a continuous line. Mand's hands were shaking, but he continued to recite prayers in a steady voice. Jonathan remained vigilant, his gaze continuously scanning the clearing's edges for any indication of movement or danger. They noticed the shift just as they were about to complete the circle. Their breath became visible in the suddenly icy air as the temperature dropped sharply in a matter of seconds. A wind started to. Then came the whispers, not from one voice but from dozens, hundreds, all speaking at once, creating an incomprehensible cacophony that made their heads hurt. The wind was a strange one, coming from all directions at once, and swirling around them in a circle. Marcus shouted for them to go on, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of murmurs that now filled the clearing. He was aware that he would die if he stopped now, that any delay would allow the forces surrounding him to. They needed an opening. He closed the protective line around the stone structure with trembling hands, finishing the circle of salt and iron. An explosion of energy threw them backward, causing them to stumble but not fall completely as soon as the circle was sealed. First to recover, Pastor M. Land knelt on the freezing clearing floor and started reciting the words Marcus had taught him about being banished. Now, his voice was powerful, driven by a tested but unbroken faith. Jonathan and Blake joined him, repeating the words, even if you didn't fully understand what they meant, and believing that what really mattered was the intention behind them. With his fingers numb from the cold, Marcus opened his book and looked for the precise passage that described the last sealing. At the clearing's edge, the shadows started to shift and compact into sharper forms. They were tall, warped beings, their shapes quivering as though they were unable to keep a steady shape on this plane of reality. They circled the clearing instead of entering it, moving in a pattern that reflected the men's surroundings, which were blown in a circle. They had an air of anticipation, as though they were waiting for one of the men to make a mistake, a single floor that would give them the opportunity to step in. After locating the desired passage, Marcus started reciting the ritual's last words. They were words in a language he didn't fully understand, a blend of sounds that appeared to be older than any language spoken by people today. He poured the prepared consecrated earth mixture over the opening of. The stone, observing it, vanish into the shadows below. Nothing happened for a while, and Marcus began to fear that the ritual might not have been successful and that the entire trip had been for nothing. Then there was a sound coming from the well's bottom. It sounded deeper and more fundamental than whispers, like the creaking of something enormous that had been immobile for centuries being forced to move. Fine fish appeared in the stone structure, radiating outward, and the ground beneath their feet started to tremble a little. From the middle, the dark shapes at the edge of the clearing started to move erratically and desperately, as though they sensed that something was shifting and that they were losing their connection to this location. Something touched Jonathan. He was pulled from the protective circle by a chilly presence that attempted to surround him. He struggled against the unseen force dragging him while clinging to Blake's arm. Blake firmly grasped him, keeping his feet firmly planted and preventing his companion from being captured. As he continued to recite the words of banishment, Mand swiftly moved to stand between Jonathan and the circle's edge, holding out his free hand in a rejection gesture. Marcus pressed a piece of cold iron against the edge of the well opening to seal the final part of the ritual after completing the last recitation. The world seemed to be holding its breath during that brief period of complete silence. Then, with a sound that was half lament, half sigh, the dark figures started to disintegrate, their shapes vanishing like smoke spread by a powerful wind. The shadows started to recede as the extreme cold subsided and daylight started to flood the clearing once more. Unable to believe it was over, the four men stood still for a few minutes. At last, Marcus went up to the stone building and took a close look at it. Now the fishes were deeper than they had been during the ritual. Additionally, he noticed that the well was filled and sealed when he peered inside, where there had previously only been a black emptiness, with stone and earth. The portal was closed, if it was one at all. Their bodies were worn out, but their minds were relieved as they slowly left the clearing. This time, the trip back through the forest was not the same. The trees had lost their ominous appearance. The ground around them seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted, and the path was more obvious. Seeing Thornwood in the distance after they eventually broke through the trees was like seeing the place with fresh eyes for the first time. In the village, word of her success spread swiftly. Sensing the difference, the villagers who had stayed in Dorothy's house cautiously came out to test the air. Everyone could sense the change, even though it was hard to pinpoint exactly what had changed. Something more akin to peace had taken the place of the oppression that had plagued Thornwood for weeks. It wasn't flawless. Although there would be scars, the immediate threat was over. Elizabeth rushed over to Jonathan and gave him a tight hug while crying streamed down her face in relief. Dorothy thanked the men for their bravery and gave them each a hug. Others came forward with simple expressions of appreciation and words of thanks. However, there was a hint of melancholy amid the festivities. Ruth Campbell was still unaccounted for. She had been abducted on that awful day when the village was enveloped in darkness. No ritual could reverse what had been done, and there was no way to bring her back. In his notebooks, Marcus recorded everything that had transpired over the next few days. He interviewed everyone who was willing to talk about their experiences in order to compile a thorough account of what happened at Thornwood. He was aware that others who might come across comparable circumstances, other locations where the line between worlds was too thin, might find this information useful. However, he was also aware that there were some parts of the experience that were impossible to describe or comprehend logically, and that there were boundaries to what could be recorded. For his part, Pastor Mland reflected silently for a considerable amount of time. What he had gone through had cast doubt on a number of his earlier convictions regarding the nature of reality and the divine. He still had faith, but it had changed and grown to accept the realization that the world was much bigger and more complex than he had ever thought. In his later sermons, he talked less about certainty and more about mystery, compassion in the face of uncertainty, and less about judgment. As the snow started to cover the mountains surrounding Thornwood and winter grew deeper, life gradually returned to something like normal. People resumed their daily activities, taking care of their farms and getting ready for the upcoming cold months. But what they had gone through had altered them all. Now, there was a common understanding that the world held depths that happily most people would never have to discover. At last, Marcus got ready to depart from Thornwood. He felt his work was done, even though he had stayed longer than he had intended. The morning of his departure, a large number of villagers gathered to say goodbye, giving him words of gratitude and supplies for the trip. Elizabeth told him that the woolen shawl she had knitted would keep him warm on the chilly mountain roads. Jonathan gave her hand a firm squeeze, expressing his emotions without using words. Marcus visited the northern forest one last time before departing. This time, he went by himself and strolled along the path he was now familiar with. The stone building stood as a testament to what had happened there, and the clearing was quiet and serene. Marcus represented a long moment, taking in everything he had discovered. Knowing that he would never be back there again, he left a small stone, a personal marker, on the structure before turning and walking away. Following the meandering roads that cut through the Appalachians, Marcus's journey took him far from Thornwood. But he kept thinking about what he had left behind as he rode. Undoubtedly, the village was now safer. Marcus knew that the story didn't end with the sealing of the portal. The mountains were enormous, teeming with ancient secrets and secret locations. What they had encountered in Thornwood was merely one aspect of a much more extensive network of mysteries that spanned the whole area. In the meantime, life in Thornwood marched steadily through the winter. The fields and rooftops were blanketed in a thick layer of snow that seemed to purify everything it came into contact with. More people collaborated than ever before. a bond formed through common adversity. Dorothy Chen opened her house on a regular basis for neighborhood get-togethers where people could congregate, eat together, and just spend time together. It served as a means of overcoming the loneliness that mountain winters invariably brought. Henry Blake started writing. He had never considered it before, but he felt compelled to document his own account of what had happened not as a scholarly work like Marcus had produced, but as a personal account of how those times had changed his perspective on the world. Using candlelight, he wrote at night, his pen flowing with words. In a stream that caught him off guard. It served as a means of processing the trauma and giving meaning to seemingly pointless things. The Whitmores made the decision to rebuild their barn. The old one stood, but it held memories they didn't want to preserve. Together, they cut new wood and built a new, clean structure during the coldest weeks. It was therapeutic, a means of reclaiming that space and turning it into something new, but it was also laborious, particularly in the cold. When they were done, they painted the walls a vivid red that stood out against the surrounding snow's whiteness. At his church, Pastor Land started hosting various services. He welcomed anyone who wished to come during the weekday afternoons to just sit in silence, meditate, or share their experiences in addition to the customary Sunday services. He found that a lot of people required a place to deal with what had transpired, a setting where they could freely express their worries and doubts without passing judgment. The church evolved into a haven of communal healing as well as a place of worship. A particularly bad snowstorm that came with January 1909 left Thornwood completely cut off for almost 2 weeks. The village was cut off from the outside world and the roads became impassable. But there was no fear of isolation this time. The populace had discovered the strength within each other. They kept tabs on their neighbors, shared supplies, and stories, music, and simple human connection can lift people's spirits. Dorothy started teaching some of the younger women the age-old weaving and sewing skills her grandmother had taught her during those 2 weeks. In addition to preserving knowledge, it was a means of producing something lovely in the midst of winter's rigor. Together, they worked in Dorothy's home, their hands occupied with threads and needles while they discussed plans for when spring finally arrived and their future aspirations. This was the period when something unexpected occurred. Someone knocked on Dorothy's door one morning after the storm had finally passed and the sun was shining on the snow-covered landscape. She opened it to discover an unidentified woman standing on her porch, shivering from the cold and covered in snow. The woman was confused and unable to articulate her identity or origins. Dorothy took her inside right away, covered her with blankets, and offered her hot tea. Details gradually came to light as the woman warmed herself. Sarah was her name, and she got lost during the storm while traveling through the mountains. Through sheer willpower and good fortune, she had managed to survive the cold for days while wandering. However, there were oddities and contradictions in her story that didn't quite add up. Her responses were evasive when questioned about specifics of her journey, as though she was unsure of what had transpired. After being called to speak with Sarah, Pastor Mann started to feel uneasy about something. No actual area of the mountains surrounding Thornwood matched the description Sarah provided of the locations she had visited. She described rock formations that were not visible on any map and valleys that did not exist. She felt as though she had been in a location that was somewhat different, displaced in some way, but still occupied the same physical space as the real world. Marcus would have recognized the signs right away if he had been present. Somehow, Sarah had crossed. She had found her way back into one of the liminal spaces that were found in the mountain's folds of reality. However, M. Land also started to recognize what had transpired with his newly broadened perspective on the world. What to do with this information and how to support Sarah in processing an experience she could hardly describe were the questions. They chose not to ask her questions that she obviously didn't have. Rather, they provided her with protection and hospitality, letting her heal at her own speed. Sarah remained at Thornwood. For a few weeks, gradually getting used to life as usual. She took part in community gatherings, assisted with everyday tasks, and eventually the gaps in her memories started to close, though some parts remained permanently hazy. The people of Thornwood started to understand something about their own neighborhood during this period. They had unintentionally turned into a sort of haven for people who had encountered the unexplainable. Because of their shared experience, they were able to embrace and accept people whose stories did not, conformed well to the standards of daily life. They accepted the responsibility with surprising grace, even though they had not sought it. There was a feeling of rebirth in Thornwood as winter gave way to spring, and the snow started to melt, exposing the dark earth beneath. In order to repair structures damaged by winter, people started planning their plantings, to consider futures that went beyond simple survival. Because Thornwood offered her the kind of acceptance she knew she wouldn't find in many other places, Sarah made the decision to stay. Locations. Spring had come, and Thornwood was blooming once more. The trees on the mountain slopes were bursting with new buds, and the fields that had been dormant under the snow were starting to sprout greenery. With its vivid colors and the song of birds that had returned from far-off migrations, it seemed as though the earth itself was commemorating the end of the gloomy winter. The villagers felt that their own internal journeys from darkness to light were reflected in this natural transformation. Sarah was able to settle in, learning the herbal remedies that the elderly woman had inherited from earlier generations while working alongside Dorothy. Even Dorothy was impressed by the sensitivity with which Sarah's hands handled plants and their applications. They worked together to cultivate a medicinal garden behind the house, sowing seeds and roots that would eventually become cures for the illnesses, aches, and fevers that afflicted the occupants all year long. It was sincere and practical work that gave Sarah a feeling of direction she wasn't certain she had prior to coming to Thornwood. In an effort to find high-quality lumber for building projects, Jonathan Whitmore started investigating the forest's less populated regions. He came to a halt on one of these expeditions after discovering something. He was certain that he had passed through this section of the forest dozens of times before. He discovered a tiny, hidden valley that he couldn't recall seeing. There was a natural spring in the middle of the valley, with crystal-clear water cascading from between the rocks to form a tiny stream that flowed down the mountain. As Jonathan knelt and drank from the extremely pure water, he experienced a deep sense of calm. After he returned to the village and shared his discovery, a small group of people went to investigate. Pastor Mand was especially fascinated because he sensed that spring was unique. It was serene, almost sacred, rather than ominous or menacing like the clearing with the stone structure had been. They made the decision to create a trail that anyone could follow by marking the way to it. The spring became a popular destination for people seeking time for introspection and solitude, serving as a natural contrast to the more gloomy areas found in the mountains. After completing his writings, Henry Blake reluctantly shared them with a few community members. The answer was poignant. In addition to capturing the actual events, his words also conveyed the feelings and internal changes that each person had gone through. Dorothy advised him to preserve the manuscript for future generations by keeping it in a secure location. Blake agreed, discreetly marking the location and carefully placing the document in a metal box he buried beneath his home's floorboards. News from other Appalachian regions started to come in as April went on. Travelers who occasionally passed through Thornwood told tales of bizarre happenings in far-off villages that seemed oddly familiar to those who had experienced the previous winter's events. There were reports of unexplained lights, forest sounds, and personal experiences. That was difficult to explain. What had transpired in Thornwood appeared to be a part of a broader pattern that extended throughout the mountains rather than an isolated incident. This insight caused conflicting emotions. Knowing that they were not alone in their experiences and that others had also dealt with the inexplicable was consoling on the one hand. However, the idea that so many locations might be susceptible to the same kind of threat that had threatened to wipe out their community was unsettling. Pastor Meland started, communicating with clergymen from different villages, sharing knowledge and giving counsel based on what they had discovered. It served as a support system for people who were on the periphery of society, and an unofficial knowledge network. During this time, Sarah started having vivid dreams. These were different nightmares than the ones that had afflicted her upon her arrival. In her dreams, she saw specific locations in the mountains that glowed in her memory with unexpected clarity. Some of the places she described to others, particularly Mand and Dorothy, were identified as actual nearby locations. In a sense, Sarah was using her dreams to map the area and pinpoint locations that held particular meaning. A cave on the upper slopes of the mountain east of Thornwood was one of the locations that kept coming up in her dreams. There was something significant in this cave that needed to be understood, but Sarah was unable to explain why she felt the need to find it. Following weeks she eventually found the courage to plan an expedition after having dreams about the same location. Both Dorothy and Jonathan, who had turned into a kind of unofficial guide for any exploration of the nearby mountains, insisted on going with her. They had to endure rocky terrain and steep trails that tried their physical stamina during the strenuous ascent to the cave. However, Sarah knew right away that it was the right location when they eventually arrived at the cave entrance. The entrance was small, concealed by a thick bush growth, and vines unnoticeable unless you knew precisely where to look. After Jonathan removed the undergrowth, an aperture that gently descended into the mountain became visible. With caution, they went inside after lighting their flashlights. The cave's interior was surprisingly spacious, with smooth walls that appeared to have been sculpted by water over a very long period of time and a high ceiling. However, it was the markings on the walls that drew their attention. They were ancient drawings rather than ominous symbols like those they had previously seen, and paintings that featured geometric patterns, animals, and human figures with a contemplative feel. They were obviously very old, having been made by people who had lived in those mountains for a very long time before any European settlers came. With her fingers lightly tracing the patterns on the walls, Sarah navigated the cave as though in a trance. Sensing that they were seeing something important, Dorothy and Jonathan silently followed her. In a room that emerged from the main tunnel deep within the cave, they discovered something remarkable. A thin layer of white sand covered the floor. Additionally, there was a circle of tiny, smooth stones in the middle, arranged in a complex pattern that appeared both deliberate and random. Sarah closed her eyes and knelt down close to the stone circle. Tears were streaming down her cheeks when she opened them again. She finally understood, she told Dorothy and Jonathan. Those who had long understood the intricate nature of the mountains built that cave as a haven for her. Ahead of them. In addition to being works of art, the markings on the wall served as maps of both spiritual and physical territory as well as instructions. The floor's circle of stones served as both a focal point and an anchor, preserving the harmony between the various facets of reality that blended together there. They studied the markings and attempted to decipher their meanings for hours in the cave. They were unable to interpret everything. Some meanings were still unclear, but they understood enough to know that they weren't the first to confront the mountain's mysteries, and that those who came before them had left behind instructions for those who would follow. Their own struggles appeared to be a part of something greater and more significant because of the reassuring continuity and cross-temporal connection. The sun was starting to set when they eventually emerged from the cave, casting pink and orange hues across the sky. They descended the mountain more quickly than they had ascended, and night had fallen by the time they reached Thornwood. They exchanged their discovery with Pastor Mand, who was profoundly touched by the account of their findings. He perceived it as a validation of his long-held belief that people's need for knowledge and defense against the unknown was a universal human trait that cut across all cultures and historical periods. Thornwood saw a subtle but significant change in the months that followed. The locals now had a fresh perspective on their home after the cave was discovered. It was no longer only a remote, mountainous area that is a part of a larger, older landscape that has been acknowledged as unique for many generations. In addition to responsibility, this realization gave them a peculiar sense of solace, the knowledge that they were a part of a greater narrative that would go well beyond their own lives. Sarah took on the role of the cave's unofficial protector. She frequently went there, sometimes by herself, and other times with people looking for a moment of clarity or serenity. She observed that spending time in the cave had a calming effect on people, as though the energy of the place itself helped to calm troubled spirits and organize jumbled thoughts. She started recording her observations in a little journal, recording both her personal experiences and the narratives of people who had visited the cave. Thornwood had an unexpected guest during the summer. On a sweltering July day, Marcus Holle rode back along the dirt road. He looked a little different. He appeared more worn out and thinner, but his eyes still gleamed with the deep curiosity that defined him. In the months since his departure, he explained, he had been traveling through the Appalachians, recording other locations where similar phenomena had taken place. Now his leather bag was even more stuffed with maps and notebooks, her expanding collection of information regarding the enigmas of the mountains. Marcus and the people of Thornwood had a heartfelt reunion. As they ate together and told him stories, they kept him informed about everything that had transpired since his departure. Marcus was clearly excited when Sarah told him about the cave and the old paintings. Sarah granted his request to be taken there right away, setting up an expedition for the next day. This time, more people joined in, including Henry Blake, Elizabeth Whitmore, and Pastor Mand. Everyone is excited to witness Marcus's first visit to that unique location. When Marcus first entered the cave, his response was precisely what they had anticipated. He lingered at the doorway for a while, just taking in the ambiance of the location. He then approached the walls, slowly and carefully examining the paintings. He pulled out one of his notebooks and started sketching quickly, noting specifics and parallels to other locations he had been to. He moved with a sense of reverence, acknowledging that he was in the presence of something genuinely important. Marcus sat on the floor and said nothing for nearly an hour after they arrived at the inner chamber with the stone circle. The others showed patience and respect by waiting, his need to think about what he was going through. At last he spoke, his voice clear in the cave's silence but low. He claimed that although he had visited similar locations in the past, sanctuaries built by ancient peoples who were aware of the terrain's complexity, none had been as well preserved or obviously purposeful as this one. He claimed that Thornwood had a sacred duty to safeguard this wealth of knowledge. This time, Marcus worked with Sarah and other people in Thornwood for a few weeks to record every aspect of the cave. They measured the chamber's dimensions, carefully copied the paintings, and attempted to interpret the stone circle's patterns. By connecting disparate locations and spotting recurring trends, Marcus shared data from his other discoveries. Since many things were still beyond his understanding, the work was painstaking and occasionally frustrating, but it was also incredibly fulfilling. Something intriguing started to occur during this time. Individuals from word of Thornwood and its inhabitants' experiences spread to other villages. Some made the trip expressly to talk to people who had survived the inexplicable. Thornwood was gradually establishing itself as a resource for people who wanted to comprehend facets of reality that the majority of people would rather ignore or mock. Nobody had predicted this change, but it appeared to be inevitable and natural. Pastor Milland was forced to provide counseling to both his own congregation and distant guests. And Broad, he devised a strategy that blended his traditional beliefs with the fresh insight he had acquired from his time at Thornwood. He discussed mystery in relation to the significance of keeping an open mind to the unknown while upholding core principles of empathy and community. Many people who felt torn between two different worlds and were unable to reconcile their extraordinary experiences with traditional belief systems found resonance in his words. Elizabeth Whitmore started providing travelers with a place to stay at her house, traveling to Thornwood. Her property had been fully restored by her and Jonathan, and there was room for guests. Elizabeth found that she had an innate ability to create a welcoming and safe space where people could tell their stories without worrying about being judged. Around the Whitmore dining table, many deep discussions occurred, resulting in the forming of relationships between individuals who would not have otherwise crossed paths. Marcus was getting ready to depart once more as August came to an end, and summer started to give way to fall. But this time, in addition to memories, he left something behind. Copies of his most significant notes, arranged in meticulously bound volumes, were given as gifts to the community. They served as useful manuals for identifying positions of authority, safeguarding against harmful influences, and differentiating between phenomena that were merely odd and those that were actually dangerous. The culmination of years of research and experience, it was a priceless gift. The evening before he left, the neighborhood hosted a unique assembly at the church. It was a celebration of everything they had learned and conquered together rather than a conventional religious service. People sang songs, told stories, and thanked each other for the courage and support they had given each other in the most trying times. In his brief remarks, Marcus thanked them for their bravery and for letting him accompany them on their journey. Everyone knew he would honor his promise to return whenever he could. When Marcus launched the subsequent, there was a sense of completion, but not finality, in the air as we rode toward the northern mountains in the morning. Thornwood was only beginning a new chapter in his story. The village had changed from a place plagued by terrifying mysteries to a sanctuary of acceptance and understanding. They would always be scarred by what they had endured, but so would the knowledge gained and the connections made over the common fire. Sarah watched Marcus vanish into the distance while standing on Dorothy's porch. She reflected on her own journey, how she had come to Thornwood disoriented and bewildered, and how she had discovered a purpose in addition to a place to call home. She no longer feared the surrounding mountains, which were still enigmatic and full of places that were beyond easy comprehension. She had discovered that mystery was not the same as danger, that the unknown could be handled with tact and respect, and that the process of learning was just as significant as the end result. The Appalachian mountains were painted by fall, with hues that appeared more vivid than before. In stark contrast to the darkness that had ruled those valleys months earlier, the slopes surrounding Thornwood were covered in shades of red, orange, and gold, creating a beauty. It seemed as though the natural world was serving as a reminder that light always returns after a period of darkness. The rhythm of village life became peaceful and reassuring. People went about their daily lives as usual, gathering the final summer produce and getting firewood ready for the impending winter, and spending chilly evenings around campfires. Those simple moments brought them a sense of calm and a fresh appreciation for the commonplace things they had previously taken for granted. The streets were once again filled with laughter, and the doors that had been locked for so long now swung open to let neighbors and guests in. Sarah kept going to the mountain cave, taking those who were looking for quiet time to think with her. The location came to represent something bigger than any of them could. Fully expressed, a place where more expansive viewpoints spontaneously surfaced, and the burden of the everyday world seemed to be lessened. In order to allow each person to have their own experience and make their own judgments, she never attempted to over-explain what transpired there. Pastor Mann's sermons took on a new depth as he talked more about the human journey through uncertainty and less about dogmatic dogma. His remarks moved people because they were based on real experience, rather than merely theory or custom. He had strolled through the shadows and came out changed, which gave everything he said substance and genuineness. Questions were welcomed as much as answers in the church, which transformed into a place of genuine healing. Together, Jonathan and Elizabeth experienced a resurgence of happiness. Rather than tearing them apart, the difficulties they had encountered had strengthened their bond in ways they never would have thought possible. On their estate, they collaborated to plan for the future while respecting the past, and they found that even the most mundane time spent together now had a deeper significance. They shared a silent thankfulness for each other and for surviving. Dorothy continued to be the center of the neighborhood, welcoming anyone in need of company, guidance, or just a hot meal into her home. In a world that had turned out to be far more unpredictable than anyone had anticipated, she had become Thornwood's kind of fulcrum, a steady presence that provided stability. After decades of living in the mountains, her wisdom was now tempered by a deeper comprehension of the mysteries that exist beneath the surface of things. In addition to writing about the past, Henry Blake also continued to write about the present and his thoughts on the future. His words came more naturally to him now, as though the experiences he had gone through had unlocked something inside of him. He found that writing allowed him to express the beauty that had blossomed in their lives after him, as well as to process trauma. There were tales of bravery, camaraderie, change, and hope that were just waiting to be honest. The people of Thornwood prepared with quiet confidence as winter drew near again, this time without the terror that had marked the previous winter. They had gained important insights into their own fortitude, the strength of community, and the significance of bravely confronting the unknown rather than rejecting it. They were aware that there were still mysteries in the surrounding mountains and that they might never fully comprehend a lot of things, but this no longer scared them. A number of families gathered at the church one evening as the first snow of the winter started to fall softly on Thornwood. The gathering was based solely on a mutual desire to be together and had no particular purpose. In private moments, they reflected on everything they had conquered, laughed at amusing memories, and told each other new and old stories. In addition to being thankful for their survival, there was a noticeable sense of appreciation for the meaning and purpose that their struggles had given them. Sarah glanced at the faces in the room, lighted by candlelight, and experienced a strong feeling. Lost and bewildered, she had come to Thornwood as a stranger. She was now a part of something greater, though. She had discovered a place where she genuinely belonged, a chosen family. With all their secrets and wonders still intact, the once dangerous mountains were now just home. Pastor Mland used straightforward but impactful words to end the evening. He talked about journeys, how facing fear transforms us, and how the journey through darkness teaches us to cherish the light. More resilient and sympathetic. He reminded everyone that the mountain's secrets would always remain, but that this was a feature of their strength and beauty. He said, "We don't need to understand everything. All we have to do is keep each other close and walk bravely." A deep calm descended upon Thornwood as the congregation eventually left the church and made their way home through the softly falling snow. The village had endured unspeakable hardships and come out stronger rather than broken. The stars were brilliant. The ancient forces that once inhabited those lands watched in silence in the clear winter sky and somewhere in the far-off mountains, possibly realizing that certain human communities had a strength of their own that was worthy of respect. This concludes our exploration of this mountain tale. In the enigmatic vastness of the old mountains, Thornwood is still surrounded by the timeless beauty of the Appalachian, a tiny glimmer of human light. If you had fun traveling with us, you might want to sign up for the channel for additional tales delving into the shadowy and fascinating recesses of forgotten locales. Tell us what you thought of this story in a comment. And until the next journey,